Good evening, everyone. And we are taking a break and going to focus on the biblical holy days and feasts and appointments of the Lord. There are many of such feasts and holy days, or what we call holidays today. And and our purpose of studying this is because it's there in the Bible and it's given in such detail, as well as the fact that many people have been looking at it from all sorts of angles. I propose today to look at all these really very much from a biblical text and also uncovering the Hebrew underlying it, and also to look at the feasts and holy days from very much a chronological viewpoint so that we understand what is said and to who and how it relates to different groups of people. And I am not here to say whether one shouldn't, and I'll stay away from that kind of an engagement, but very much so that I hope that we could see and analyze the scripture. And I trust that it is not an exhaustive study. And I would encourage all of us to go and check it out. Go study the text, because it is important that you look at the text carefully rather than hear somebody talk about it. And so this evening, I really want to go into the text to discuss some of these elements of the holy days, feasts, and appointments. So let's begin. Let me begin by painting out the chronology of how the Bible has unfolded itself. And very much so, you could see that it is in a timeline. And in the timeline itself, I think it would be useful for us to realize that much of the timeline starts from Genesis. And I hope that you can see that, right? It starts from Genesis and it goes into a time of Exodus. And at Exodus, we have a point called Mount Sinai. And we also have another point called post-exile. Post-exile means this is after the Babylonian period, where they came back to Jerusalem to rebuild, and that would affect the Second Temple. Now, much of what we do in our Bible study is that we hardly look at the panorama from this viewpoint. Allow me to suggest to you, before we begin looking at certain texts, that much of what is written is about Israel. And let me just put this down. It's really about Israel. However, there is a lot that was written that was done before Israel ever came about. And I would suggest that that would be an important aspect to consider, because in this particular period of time, we have 50 chapters of the book of Genesis. We have 42 chapters of the book of Job. And amongst this, you find that there is no mention of Israel as a nation, right? This would be Israel as a nation. Now, in the book of Genesis, of course, Jacob is there towards the end, and his 12 sons, and eventually that turned out to be the nation of Israel. But I just want us to just bear in mind that this period of time right here has a lot to do with our chronological timeline when we study the Bible. And the first topic that we are studying is with regards to the Sabbath. And the Sabbath needs to be seen very clearly in this context. And the Sabbath really begins right here in the book of Genesis, in the first and second chapter of the book of Genesis, and we'll trace that. And so I want to share with you a perspective of studying the holy days and feasts and appointments of God, not from a traditional view of telling the stories around it, but really to look at the text from this viewpoint. So let's begin by looking at the very initial instance of the Bible in the book of Genesis, and we'll look at all the texts leading up to Mount Sinai. The first verse that I want to point out to you comes from verse 14. Now, I would really encourage everyone to spend time to study the book of Genesis from the very first chapter and the very first verse. It is not in our context today to do a detailed study of the book of Genesis, but I want to highlight to you in verse 14, where we begin our study by looking at this particular word. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, for days and years." This particular word, season, is an important word for us to pay attention to, because the word actually means appointments. Now, for whatever reason, the English translation has translated it as a season or a festival. The proper term is an appointment, meaning it is a time to meet. And very interestingly, on the fourth day of the book of Genesis, God actually sets all these in place so that we have a way of calculating our time of day, our month, a day of the month, as well as month of the year. And all of these, when you look up to the heavens, you see the constellations, you see the moon, the sun, all of them actually play a role to determine the time of year. And in the particular time of year, given the month and the day of the month, one can, with precision, know the time to meet God. And so this is the beginning. I wanted to point out to you that this word seasons is that God actually put all these celestial bodies in place very much to make sure that the nation of Israel, as time went on, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which we call the Torah, is to make appointments for them to meet God on a particular month of the year, in a particular day of that month. And so this is to point out to us that God is a detailed God. He is not saying, well, in general, if you just find some time, come and meet me. That's not how God operates with Israel. God operates in a very precise manner, in a very detailed manner. In the first day of the 7th month, on the 10th day of the first month, on the 14th day of the first month, on the 14th day of the 7th month. You know, all of these requires precision. And Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 gives us that flavor in the Hebrew, not in the English. Our next verse comes from Genesis chapter 2. Now, in Genesis chapter 2, I draw your attention to verse 2 and 3. If you happen to read Genesis chapter 1, you would find there were 6 days of the creative acts that God had put in place. And in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Now back to our A and B, you would find that this is generally what you will be able to see. This is an A and this is a B. Meaning these two statements are basically telling the same thing, right? It is about the seventh day, and God ended his work which he had done. And then he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. And so this is basically an A and B. And so it's an emphasis. When it's an emphasis, we should pay attention to it. Now understand this. Yom HaShavi'i, this word seventh, is an ordinal, but it comes from a cardinal number 7. The cardinal number 7 is Shiva, right? It's Shiva. And that would be 7 in the cardinal sense of the word. So the seventh day really is derived from the word Shiva. Now, the next word that is interesting would be the fact that God had rested. And it's this word here. And rested really means Shabbat, right? Shabbat. And this is the same play of words. This is not a Hebrew class, but I just want to point out to you that it's there in the text itself. Again, Shiva, on the seventh day, which from all the work that he has done. Now, the word ended right here, this word ended literally means at an end, complete, right? Completion. And he stopped. And that's basically what this word kala actually means. From the things that God has been doing, right? From what he has, from the work that he's doing. Now, the word work is important. The word work here literally means his, let's put it this way, the regular activities, the regular business that he has been performing, right? That's what it means by doing. And God rested on the seventh day from all his work. Again, the word work here is all his business. The word business means the things that he is busy with on the day to day. And that's important for us to realize that Sabbath, the seventh day, has to do with work, which he has done. Now, we'll get back to this. Let me just point out to you that there is a play of words, Shiva, Shabbat, and it's about work and about ceasing his work. And so the word rested here, Shabbat, which is where we get the name of the seventh day, Shabbat, really means stopping, ending, ceasing, resting from the regular work that God has been doing for 6 days. And then on this seventh day, it is different from the other days. That's the picture that's being painted in verse 2. And then in verse 3 tells us, and then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. Again, I point out to you the Hebrew words, the seventh day, that which is Shabbath, and he sanctified it, he made it holy. This is Kadosh. And in it, he rested, and that would be Shabbat, from all his work, his business, which he had bara and asa. Now, all these, we will take it when we do a Hebrew word study, but just suffice to say that this basically says that in chapter 1, all the things that he's been doing, day 1, day 2, day 3, he stopped on day 7. And the fact that he made Kadosh, sanctified or made it holy, basically means that he made it special. How is the 7th day special or different from the other 6 days? Is that in this 7th day, he stopped, he ceased, he rested, he put an end to what he was doing in those 6 days. That is the picture that is painted here. And make holy basically means make different, make special. And so you can see that the 7th day in God's mind is different from the rest of the days. And chapter 1 and chapter 2 really is here to teach us how to count 7 days in a week. And what did God do is for us to remember. Chapter 1, in all his creative acts that he bara and asa. And then he Shabbat on the 7th day, which is Shavi'i, Yom HaShavi'i. And that in itself is the basis of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not in particular a lesson given to Israel just yet, but it was given in the book of Genesis before Israel ever came about in the book of Exodus. And hence, that is why this 7th day, in the way that God has painted the book of Genesis, provides us his view of the world. His view is 6 days he's been busy doing things, and very important things that we now can look back and study the 6 days of creation. And then on the 7th day, he made it different, and hence that was why he was pointing out that the 7th day is really different altogether. Now, what does rest actually mean? Rest. Rest is to stop doing what you regularly has been doing. So God has been creating and God has been making, and he stopped. And so what does it mean for mankind and humanity is to realize that there is a day that one has to stop and take a break and rest from all the things that we are doing. And that would be a good picture to paint right here. Now, in order to understand the concept of rest, or the word Shabbat, let us go to Exodus chapter 5, verse 5. We haven't come to the nation of Israel yet, but we are getting there. Now, in Exodus chapter 5, it is the beginning of the encounter of Moses with Pharaoh. And in verse 5, chapter 5, verse 1, talks about Moses and Aaron, who's going to speak on behalf of Moses, went in to speak to Pharaoh. And this is a very important picture. Moses is an equal to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh is an Elohim to his people. Moses is made an Elohim to Pharaoh, and they are on equal terms. And so, thus says Jehovah, God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me. And so this is what is already starting to say, a feast to me. Now in Exodus chapter 5, verse 1, the word feast is an interesting word, and we will look at that in days to come. And this really is the word Hagah, and it is spelled this way. And the word Hagah really means a feast, a festival, a jump for joy, a celebration. And we will tackle this when we come to the feast. Today we're looking at the Sabbath. And so in verse 5, Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor." And that is the word that I want us to understand. This word is cause them to put an end from what they are doing, right? What are they doing? Their labor, this would be their compulsory work. And Pharaoh is angry. And so this is the word. This word comes from the word Shabbath, right? It comes from this word Shabbath, so that we understand that the idea of rest, as we get into Exodus chapter 20, gets this concept. It doesn't change in meaning in the Bible. So when God says it's rest, it means a stop. What they have been doing is they've been working and working, and then in this particular exercise, they actually stopped doing what they do. And that's what it means to, I guess, to rest. And so resting is Shabbat. And that's where we get the word Shabbat, or the English word Sabbath. Let me give you one more, and then we will be mindful that these are just examples to show us what Shabbat actually means. Now, in chapter 12 of Exodus, and we are not going to cover this chapter today because this is about the Passover, and we'll do that tomorrow. But in this chapter, in verse 15, it says this: 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. And this word, remove leaven, verse 15, basically means to Shabbat leaven, meaning to put a rest to leaven from your house, to put a ceasing to leaven, meaning leaven is in your house every day. And so on the first day of these 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you shall really Shabbat. That's the idea of the word Shabbat. God Shabbat on the 7th day. And so in the first day of these 7 days of unleavened bread, you shall remove. Now this word on, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. It really means by the first day, right? It doesn't mean on the first day, but by the first day, which means that it has to be done before the first day has arrived. But that's for tomorrow. But this is the word I wanted us to understand. The word Shabbat doesn't change because it is about resting, ceasing, putting a stop to what is regularly done on the other days. Now, we come to our major portion, which is in Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, famous words, the 10 Commandments. And I want to point out to us that at this point in time, the nation of Israel is the audience. In Genesis, it is all humanity. And now the story, the narrative is narrowing down to the nation of Israel. And they have been rescued and taken out of Egypt and now in the wilderness before Mount Sinai. And at this point in time, 10 statements are given, which is commonly called the 10 Commandments. And I just want us to pay attention to verse 8 to verse 11. And this would be important. This would be very important for our study with regards to the Sabbath. It says, remember. Remember. And this is actually Yom HaShabbat, the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath day is Shabbat. This is how the Hebrew is written. The reason why the English doesn't have the H is because the Sabbath is taken from a Greek word instead of the Hebrew word. So the Hebrew transliteration is Shabbat, right? It's a sh and not a s. And then it says to keep it holy. Remember, we've seen this word before, holy, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. And so God is now zooming down to the nation of Israel to keep it holy. And the idea of keeping it holy literally means to make holy. So the word keep is not the regular word keep. It basically says to make holy, to make special. Now, how do you make the Sabbath day, which is called Yom HaShabbat? How do you make the Sabbath day special? How do you make the Sabbath day different? Well, it says 6 days you shall work and do everything you normally do, but the seventh day, and this is the same word, right? Shabbat. The idea is from the number 7, which is Shiva. And let me put this down. The 7th day, Shiva, and is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. What does it mean that it is the Sabbath of the Lord your God? It means that it is the rest, right? This is the Shabbat. This is the rest of the Lord your God. And this really refers back to our base verse, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. It says, in it you shall do no work. And it describes everyone, including the stranger in your gates. And you can only have gates, by the way, when you're in the promised land, right? So this is with regards to the future. So in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. And he rested on the 7th day. So understand this. In verse 11, he says that he had rested in the 7th day. The idea of rested in the 7th day is really to, well, how should we say? It actually means to quiet down. This is not Shabbat, right? This is Yanach. This is from the name of Noah, right? And it says to quiet down. It means to be at repose. And so this is another word to contrast that God is doing so much. And then on the 7th day, he quieted down. And that is the reason why God blessed the Sabbath day. Sabbath day, that is the Shabbat. and hallowed it. Hallowed it means make holy or special or different, right? And so understand, holy does not have a moral connotation. So don't assume the moral connotation. When God made the Sabbath day holy, how can a day be moral? It's nothing to do with morality, but it is something to do with being special, being different. Because 6 days God was doing all kinds of things and putting the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And so you get the picture of the Sabbath day. And God is now telling the nation of Israel, and that is important because the nation of Israel is to make a point to show and demonstrate that the Sabbath is what God has told them to remember. Okay? And this word here, remember, means bring to mind. It means don't forget it. When the Sabbath day arrives, you bring to mind. But you need to understand that the Sabbath day is different from our day of counting. Remember, it starts from sunset to sunset. So it starts after the sunset of the 6th day, and then it enters into the 7th day. And right at sunset of the 7th day, it starts the 1st day. And so that would be how the Bible has described the Sabbath day. And I guess it's something for us to think about, because the way that the biblical day is counted is always from sunset to sunset. And the 7th day begins right after the sunset of the 6th day. And then it ends towards the sunset of the 7th day. And once sunset of the 7th day passes, it goes back in the cycle of the 1st day of the week. And so now let us bring this to bear. These are words that is now stated to the nation of Israel. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it special, make it special. And in this day, you are to remember what God has done in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And you make it different. And hence, the nation of Israel, when they keep the Sabbath day, will tell us that they are about the only nation in the world that treats the 7th day different from everyone else in the world. And so when people look at them, it's like, wow, why do they do that? Because it's an instruction from their God. And that is how they are seen to be special, different. So God says, be holy, be special, be different. So they are going to be different from the rest of the nations because they have this particular day called the 7th day or the Shabbat day to make things different. Now, a little bit down the road in Exodus chapter 31. In Exodus chapter 31, and reading from verse 12, we begin to see some important elements of this Sabbath, which we seldom read. And I would just want to make a note that in Genesis, it was talking to, I guess, everyone, because the nation of Israel has not yet come about. But just now we read in Exodus chapter 20, the nation of Israel has already been formed and announced and made a covenant with God in Exodus chapter 19 at the foothills of Mount Sinai. Now in Exodus chapter 31 and reading from verse 12 gives us more detail about the Sabbath. And so God said to Moses and says, speak to the children of Israel. And we take note and cognizance that they are the intended audience of this passage. And so it says, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, which means that there is more than the seventh day. Sabbaths are days of rest. Days of rest, not a single day, but days of rest. Sabbath day would be the seventh day. But Sabbaths, as in plural in Exodus 31, verse 12, is to tell us that there are many Sabbaths, and we will look at them as we come to each of the feasts. But the important thing I think that we should pay attention to is this. It is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Jehovah who sanctifies you. And so let's break this down a little bit. He says this is a sign, this is a mark, which means that when you look at Israel and they are keeping the Sabbaths of God, people can see. So Sabbath is not in the heart kind of thing, right? It's something that can be seen. And it is between Jehovah and Israel. And not just this generation in chapter 31, but it says throughout your generations. So it's perpetual, meaning it's to tell Moses, to tell Israel that this is not a one-time thing for a one generation or a one-time special deal. This is a perpetual deal. And the intent of the Sabbaths is that they may know, and the word know is to experience. Is to experience, to get familiar, to see that Ani, God, is Jehovah. And he is the one who makes you holy. And by holy, special, right? Unique, different. And so the Sabbath really is an indicator that everyone can see that between Jehovah, God, and Israel throughout their generations, for them to know God. And so Sabbath is really to know God. It is not it's not just a rule or a law, but it has an intent. So God's intention, whenever we think about the Sabbath, is about who he is. He is the creator, the maker of heaven and earth. He did it in 6 days, and he ceased and he rested on the seventh. And that is the intent of the Sabbath. And now when it's given to the Israelites, they are to know God as the creator. And by keeping the Sabbath, they will be different, right? They will be different. And so it says, you shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. So it is special to you. And you would now begin to see that the Sabbath is treated as an incredibly important day to the Israelites and to the Jews today. But little do we read that God is so serious, because God wants the Israelites to demonstrate to the rest of the world that God is the true and living God. And by keeping the Sabbath, everyone around them can see that they are special and there is God amongst them. And so God says, everyone who defiles it shall be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be karat from his people. Meaning, God is so serious that he doesn't want anyone to deviate from this rule. Now, is this rule going to make anything special out of it? Basically, it is a reflection of who God is. That God rested, his people rested, and hence it reflects on who God is. That is the heart of God in the Sabbath. Work shall be done only for 6 days, but the seventh day is the Shabbat of rest. Now, verse 15 is important. It is something which I think we don't see. And so we see this. The word Shabbat of rest is not a good translation, unfortunately. This is, how should you say? It is the Shabbat of Shabbat. This is the Sabbath of Sabbath. This is the Sabbath of the yes, rest. It is the most important of the Sabbath. So the seventh is the rest. You might rest on other days, but the seventh is the most important of all these cessation of work. It is holy to God. So it's not just for men to say, well, let me just think about it. So the Sabbath day to the Israelites is special. And so whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he will be put to death. And so the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout the generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And the reason is, it is to remember who God is. Who is God? God is the God of creation. And so Sabbath really is to point the Israelites to consider God as the creator. And that is what I'm trying to point out to us today, that Sabbath, as is given in the book of Exodus, is very much between God and Israel, right? It is a sign between God and the children of Israel. Is it one time? No. It is forever, right? What does forever mean? And in this case, this is olam. Verse 17, it is olam. It is for a long time. And it is a sign, olam, a long, long time. And as long as Israel is there, they should remember it as a sign. Well, you can say that this is a sign, and it is also seen as a covenant, right? It is also seen as a covenant. Perpetual is also olam. For a long time, this is an agreement between Israel and God. And they are to do that. And so it's, well, I guess you can say it's not optional for Israel. God has made it mandatory because observance of Sabbath by Israel makes them stand out, unique, different in the world, and demonstrates to the world that God exists amongst them. And that is the whole concept of Sabbath, as I had wanted to share with us today. Now, let us come to the modern day. The modern day is important for us to understand. A long time has passed, and if you're not part of Israel, you probably have a problem of the Sabbath. Why? Because a lot of things cannot be done on the Sabbath. And the question would be this: if we are not one of Israel, we really don't know exactly what has happened since the days of Moses, through the days of judges, the kings, and then they were thrown out of Israel, and then went to Babylon and returned back to Babylon, rebuilt the temple, and then they were kicked out of Judea by the Romans, and then now they came back to the current state of Israel, and they have this Sabbath issue. And a lot has changed since. And thereby it creates a lot of problems for Israel to observe the Sabbath. If the Sabbath is perpetual or olam, how then should Israel do things? And so I could just share with you what they are doing today. In modern times, they rely on something called the oral Torah. And this is what they say, right, has been passed down to them about the details of what to do. Now, granted, when we look at the text of the Bible, it gives us very broad headlines as you must keep the Sabbath, but what exactly do you mean by keeping the Sabbath? And so they say that the Bible says you should cease, right? Cease from work. And hence, the Jews have a problem of defining work. And hence, throughout the thousands of years that the nation of Israel has been observing the Sabbath, they have been passing down what they call the oral traditions. Okay? And without the oral traditions, they would have a hard time trying to figure out what can they do and what can they not do. And so there are something like 39 categories. I would say categories because it's a challenge. So I'm not going to define it for you. But basically, it is about work. If you are plowing and sowing, all these are things that you normally do, you should stop doing it. And the challenge that they have today is this. How do you define what is acceptable and not acceptable? And that is from the oral traditions. And so that's how they are keeping it today. One of the biggest challenges is this. They're not supposed to light a fire. They're not supposed to cook. They're not supposed to do many things. But at the advent of the electricity, something has to change. Because in the past, they would have to burn wood. But now you don't have to burn wood. You've got gas, you've got gasoline, you've got electricity, you've got electric cooker. And so is that still considered lighting a fire? That's all the things that they grapple with. So I just want to point out to you that it is a challenge for them to consider all the changes in the community and in tradition, in time, in advancement of inventions, and they are adjusting. And hence the oral tradition will never stray away from the base headlines of the scripture that they are to keep. So they can't say, well, we are in modern times, let's give it a pass. Because of all the words that we've read in Exodus chapter 20, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, in Exodus chapter 31, the nation of Israel has to look at this very seriously. Now, I just want to point out one more thing, and then we will put an end to our study. And that would be Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5. When we get to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5, this last point I want to make to you is this. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and in it the Sabbath. For if a man does, he shall live by them. Ani Yehovah, I am the Lord. And this is how they have interpreted live. In the event that someone is dying, then they are to make all adjustments, even on a Sabbath, to save a life. Because if a life is not maintained, then there is no way to keep the statutes and judgments of God. And so they are looking at this very literally, that even on a Sabbath, if somebody a life needs to be saved, they will save a life. And you would read of it in many instances, like there was an earthquake in Haiti, and the Israel rescue team went to save them on the Sabbath. And people were wondering, hey, aren't you supposed to rest on the day of Sabbath? And they say, no, they will actually break the law if they let anyone die on the Sabbath. And so it is more important for a life to be preserved than to allow a life to die and to keep the Sabbath. And so that in itself, I thought, would be very interesting for us to consider. That life and living is important to be considered, as opposed to just blindly keeping the Sabbath. And with this, we come to the end of our session today with regards to the Sabbath, so that I hope that we can see the difference between Genesis to Exodus, and then Exodus in the text itself, how serious God is with regards to the nation of Israel, to make sure that this is maintained as a sign of a covenant, a perpetual covenant for a long, long time. And it's not a choice really to them, because it is to make them be different. And so our basis, as we began, is in Genesis chapter 2. And we have seen what rest is all about, and how God made it very important to the nation of Israel. And with that, there will be other Sabbaths that we will consider in the coming days. But suffice for our study today, we will come to an end right here.